Verify that the power cord is plugged into the wall securely. And turn the power switch on. If the embedded screen still doesn't turn on, you'll need to grab your multimeter to check power coming out of the wall. Insert the multimeter leads into the power receptacle. You should have at least 110 volts for 110 volt systems or 208 volts for 220 volt systems. If you have no voltage out of the receptacle, then you'll want to check your breaker on the wall. Make sure that the power cord is plugged in securely to the bottom of the treadmill. Disconnect and reconnect the power cord to make sure it has a nice firm connection. While you're there, check and make sure that you have the zip tie strain relief on the power cord. Now that we verified we have power coming from the wall, our treadmill is plugged into the wall securely, the treadmill is turned on, and our power cord is securely plugged into the underside of the treadmill, we want to check the 18 amp breaker next to the power switch. Press the breaker to ensure that it has not been tripped. After checking the breaker and all the wall power and everything, if the unit still doesn't power up, lift your motor shroud and check your motor control board. Verify that there are LEDs lit across the board. If the MCB lights don't come on, you'll want to check the power coming out from the EMI filter. Your EMI filter is located right here. Before you put your hands inside the shroud area, what you'll want to do is make sure you turn the on-off switch to the off position. Once it's off, then what you'll want to do is you're going to disconnect the cables that go out of the EMI filter and into the MCB. Once you've disconnected the two wires, you're going to turn the power switch back on. Using your multimeter leads, you're going to carefully touch the two terminals. You should have between 110 and 120 volts AC. If there is no power coming out of the EMI filter, turn the power switch off and reconnect the cables. Then disconnect the brown and blue wires from the input of the EMI filter. Insert the multimeter leads into the brown and blue wires coming from the on-off switch. Then turn the switch on. You should get between 110 to 120 volts AC. If you have voltage here, but there's no voltage coming out of the EMI filter, then you'll need to replace the EMI filter. If you have no voltage coming out of the on-off switch, then you'll need to replace the on-off switch or the onboard circuit breaker. Once you've verified there is power coming out of the EMI filter, you'll want to make sure that that power is reaching the motor control board. What you want to do is you're going to slide your multimeter leads behind the brown and blue wires. Then you're going to want to turn your power switch to the on position, and you should be reading between 110 to 120 volts AC. If you don't get a reading here, but you have power coming out of here, you could be looking at a faulty power cable. Replace this cable. Once you verify that you do have power coming into the motor control board, yet the LEDs still do not turn on, you'll need to verify fuse 1 on the motor control board and make sure that it's not blown. Before removing the fuse, make sure that you've turned the on-off switch to the off position. The best way to check and make sure that the fuse is good is to use your multimeter. I've set my multimeter on continuity check, and you can see if there's a short, it starts to beep. And so you want to test the fuse this way and make sure that it is definitely has continuity, which this one does. If you look inside the fuse, and you can see that the little wire inside here is burnt or totally just charred away, or if you do this continuity test and you don't get any continuity, then you want to replace the fuse. Once we verify that we have sufficient power coming from the wall, we've checked our fuse and our fuse is good, or we've replaced our fuse yet the MCB still does not light up, you'll want to go ahead and replace the MCB. Now that we have the lights on the MCB, we know that there's power going to it and that everything should be working. But if our embedded screen still doesn't power up, the next thing we need to do is we need to determine what type of MCB we have. There are two types of MCB. This is a version 1 MCB. This board requires an external 12-volt power supply to send power up to the embedded screen, the PVS kits, or display electronics for the fan power supply. The version 2 MCB does not require an external power supply. It has one built on board. With the version 1 MCB, the first thing you want to do is you want to check and make sure that the LED on the power supply is lit. If the LED on the power supply is off, disconnect your power cable going up to your embedded screen. If the light comes back on, then you have a short somewhere in the power cable. Replace the power cable. If you disconnected the power cable, yet the LED still does not come on, you're going to need to get your multimeter. Insert the multimeter leads into the brown and blue wires going into the power supply. With your meter set to AC voltage, you should read the same voltage or very close to the same voltage as what you are getting into the MCB. If there is 120 volts going into the power supply, yet the LED on the power supply is not lit, the power supply will need to be replaced. If you don't have 120 or 110 volts coming into the power supply, then what you'll need to do is verify that you have it coming out of the motor control board. The first thing you want to do before you disconnect the cable that goes into the motor control board is turn the power switch off. Disconnect the power supply cable from the MCB. Slide your multimeter leads into pins 1 and 3. You should get between 110 to 120 volts, depending on what the input power is. If you have no voltage here, replace the motor control board. If you do have voltage here, then what you'll want to do is replace your power supply cable. Disconnect the power supply cable from either the power supply or the MCB, depending on what type of motor control board you have. And you want to visually inspect it to see if there are any burn marks. As you can see in this one we have here, has a slight burn mark right here. Also inspect the power cable whenever it plugs into the embedded touchscreen. Make sure it doesn't have any burn marks on it as well. If you see any burn marks on the top or bottom connector for the power cable, replace it. To check the voltage coming out of the power supply, you want to get your multimeter and you want to set it to DC voltage. Slide the leads behind the black and white wire coming out of the power supply. You should have about 12.2 volts coming out of the power supply, and this is DC voltage. To check and make sure that your MCB is sending the 12 volts to the embedded display, you want to set your multimeter on DC voltage. Set your multimeter leads behind the white and black wire on the power supply cable. You should have about 12 volts DC. If you have 0 or anything less than 11.2 volts, you'll want to replace the MCB. If you have 12.9 or 12.09 or 12 volts or higher, then you'll need to check power up at the embedded screen. When checking power at the top, you must check power with the power supply cable plugged into the embedded screen. To do this, just slide your multimeter leads behind the black and white wire. You should have about 12 volts DC up here as well. If you have anything less than 11.2, then you may need to replace the power supply cable. One way to quickly troubleshoot is to get an external power source. All you're going to need is an AC adapter and the power cable from either a bike or a total body trainer. Once you connect the power cord into the wall, connect the power supply to the other end of the cable. The opposite end of that cable is a connector, and there may be two, that you will plug in to the embedded screen. Disconnect the power cable from the underside of the embedded screen. Then connect your external power supply cable into the embedded screen. The embedded screen will start to power up. If it powers up, we at least know that the embedded screen is good and will not need to be replaced. Check the power connector on the underside of the embedded screen. Make sure that it isn't loose or broken off. Just wiggle it to make sure that it doesn't fall off or that it's really loose. If you've determined that you do have the approximate 12 volts DC going up to the embedded screen, yet it still does not power on, there's one more step, and that's what we call jumping the screen. Note that this step can only be performed on the version 1 embedded screens. Do not attempt to open up a version 2 embedded touchscreen. The way to determine whether or not you have a version 1 or version 2 is to look at the coaching USB stick and find out how it's connected. The version 2 embedded screens will have the stick, and if you look underneath on the right side back here, you could see the cable where the USB stick connects. If you see this, it is a version 2 screen and it should not be opened up. The version 1 that have coaching will have the stick right here in the center. If it's an older machine that doesn't have coaching, there'll be no USB port at all on the screen. In order to remove the sheet metal housing, you're going to need to take the screen off the treadmill. Remove the screws that go around the outside of the sheet metal to access the motherboard. Once you have the sheet metal cover off, you want to locate the pins towards the top of the motherboard. Using a small screwdriver, you want to short together the two pins as follows. If the screen powers up, then everything will be operational. If the screen still does not power up, go ahead and replace the embedded screen.